We've got Tom Wood from Mismatch Brewing. Now, Tom's got a pretty long history for what seems like a pretty young guy in brewing. Having had a look at Tom's background over the last couple of days in preparation, he's been across a few different breweries and done quite a few different jobs. So, Tom, do you want to give us a bit of an intro about yourself and really kind of cover off? You obviously grew up in South Australia, it seems, and you're kind of a local boy.
Yep.
Just run through your kind of how you got into brewing and if you always kind of wanted to be in brewing.
Yeah, sure. So probably the first part to that is whether I wanted to be from the word go, and the answer is no to that. I basically finished school in 2010 and went to University of Adelaide to study a Bachelor of Environmental Science. Did honours in environmental biology. So I think my plan really there was to go into the environmental science sort of field. Loved being outside, loved sort of working with my hands. So wanted to incorporate something along those lines into some sort of a career. And it was around about probably third year uni where home brewing became a hobby for me. I actually had a late friend whose dad I used to catch up with and family used to catch up with to sort of keep in the loop. After my good friend passed away at sort of age 16, I used to go around for dinner and have some of his home brews. And that was the first time where it even really occurred to me that you could make a beer at home. I sort of asked him a few questions and he helped me out, did a few brew days with him. And from there, I really pretty much took it up on my own and did it at home. And it sort of went from being a slight interest into a pretty big hobby and then into a real passion. So, that sort of spiraled relatively quickly out of control throughout third year uni and honours. And it was around about then when I actually applied for a role at Cooper's. Once again, not necessarily 100% sure it was what I wanted to do, but a friend sort of steered me in the direction when they had a Cooper's guy come in to one of his lectures. And gave out an email address. So I sent off my CV and went and did an interview down with Cooper's. And I think there was about 16 of us that they were looking for one role, and I didn't get the job, unfortunately, but that was all right. So that's sort of where I decided, I think, okay, this is actually something I really want to pursue and do. And so after that, after honours, I sort of had a little bit of a bit of time to think about what I really wanted to do and which sort of jobs we're going to start looking at getting. And I went and did a TAFE course at Regency TAFE with Stephen Nelson, which isn't the one I think is offered now, but it was essentially a preparation for the Institute of Brewing and Distilling General Certificate, with the thought that you would then the course went for, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks, and then right at the end, the IBD exam was there to do as well at Regency. I did that whilst I was applying for jobs. Didn't apply to too many in the end. It was, I think, Stone and Wood and then Bright Brewery who got in. I was in talks with them during that and ended up getting a gig up there. So that was sort of how I got my way into the industry.
Yeah, awesome. So if you take a step back a little bit, obviously you kind of develop a passion for brewing kind of third year uni and after that. What did you want to do prior? Did you want to go and, did you have your eyes on a professional career or a trade? Or obviously you're a smart guy, you've gone and done a science degree at university. So what kind of, where did you see yourself when you were kind of coming through high school?
Yeah, I think when I was at high school, I was definitely not one of those people who knew what they wanted to do. So I always envied the kids who had this sort of path ahead of them, I suppose, who were like, yeah, I want to be, a carpenter, I want to be a sparkier, I want to go and be a doctor or something like that. I was never that kid. And school was not necessarily for me somewhere I thrived necessarily. I loved going to school, had lots of mates there, but I wasn't top of the class in anything. And so originally I actually wanted to be carpenter or go into the trade, into building, once again, sort of like I said, with working with my hands, doing something relatively hands-on. And I sort of dropped that idea around about year 12, not for any necessarily particular reason, but I just sort of felt like maybe I wanted to do something a little bit more sciencey or something. I've always loved learning. So despite not perhaps being the best high school student in the world, learning was something I really enjoyed. And I think uni, once I got into it, I really enjoyed that process of learning. And so I think I would have been happy enough doing something in environmental science and sort of working in that field. I think I probably became a little bit jaded in the scientific community going through uni and realizing the reality of it, in the sense of probably how much research and work goes in, and especially in environmental, how much impact you're able to make can be sometimes a little bit limited.
Sure.
And
for
so
sure. Yeah, for sure.
Brewing was kind of this perfect mix of learning, science, being hands-on, almost trade-like in a way, but something where I could be constantly challenged, which is something throughout my career I've noticed I need to have a challenge in front of me all the time. So yeah, that's kind of how I worked through that coming out of high school.
Yeah, awesome. I tend to agree with you about it's very hard when you're coming through university, and I did the same. I didn't study a science degree, but when you're coming through university, you realize pretty quickly that what you thought it was, it never is, and a lot of it is driven by. A lot of it's driven by, I guess, money, and politics drives a lot of, especially when you're talking about the sciences, with what you can research and the impact that you can have. A lot of it's driven by money and politics, and unless you're super passionate about kind of both of those things, it tends to be a pretty difficult field. So you get your degree, you go off and you get a job at Bright, at Bright Brewery. Who was that with, and what kind of impact did that have on your learning as well as your career?
Yeah, so that was really good. So I basically just applied. They were offering a job for a sort of an assistant brewer role there, and it was essentially me and one other, Rich Chamberlain, who's gone on to do great things in beer as well. We both started on the same day. He came from Mildura Brewery. I came from nowhere.
Yep.
Experience-wise. And that was just a really, really good experience in terms of, we had a little brew pub there and also building a production facility. So, I really sort of applied, was in talks with them for a few weeks, and then I got the job and thought, crap, now I need to move into state. So it was my first move out of home. So it was a fairly big leap of faith in a way. But one that I knew I needed to do. And I think moving out of SA was good in terms of, from a brewing career, being able to develop as quickly as possible and have as many opportunities as possible. It seemed like a fairly logical step to me. So, the next step was to sort of pack up everything I had and move to Little Bright, which is a gorgeous part of the world.
Yeah, awesome. And then, so who did you work with at Bright, and what kind of impact did they have on your career, kind of looking back?
Yeah, so the owner of Bright Brewery, Scott, he was a big part of. He worked very closely with us in the brewing team. So it was literally in the brew house, it was just Rich and me, but Scott had a lot of involvement, and he's particularly passionate about the environmental side of things. So Bright is extremely environmentally focused, obviously being very close to nature up there, but also with big solar systems, and Scott looking at every little way he can be as environmentally friendly as possible, whether that was down to reusing cartons in the brew pub. So the guys would rip the 6-packs out as they sold, and we would literally go and tape them up and do things like that, just to try and minimize our impact as much as possible. So Scott was big for that, and guiding me in sort of making beer and being in manufacturing as responsibly as possible.
Yep.
And then on the brewing side, Rich was a very technical brewer, which is exactly what I've tried to sort of mold myself into, and go down that more sort of technical aspect or path, I suppose. There's obviously a fairly creative, artistic side to brewing, but there's also the technical aspect, and that he was extremely good at that. So he influenced me in a big way in terms of the way I make beer. But yeah.
So, and obviously making beer at scale, which is what you, I guess, really at the end of the day, commercially, you kind of have to do. You obviously need to be pretty technically strong to be able to recreate what you're making at in real volumes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Bright and Mismatch as well are both breweries that focus on their core range a lot, and so consistency and repeatability is really, really important. There's beers that you're known for that people need to be able to open 3 months apart and have it taste exactly the same. So you can have a brew where you're brewing something different every day, and maybe that consistency matters a little bit less. But for most of the brews I've worked out, that technical excellence and that consistency of process has been really, really important. That's the sort of stuff that excites me as well. So it's definitely been a theme throughout all the breweries I've been at.
Yeah, awesome. And then obviously from Bright, you make a really big shift and you go and work with Little Creatures, and then obviously it gets snapped up into part of Lion throughout that process, no doubt. Run me through the differences that you saw when you left Bright, obviously a smaller operation than Little Creatures, and then going into a larger, more established brewery like Little Creatures.
Yeah, it was a really big change. So it was also probably happened slightly early. I think pretty much every stage that I've moved on to has happened maybe twice as quickly as I anticipated,
which is a good thing.
And it's exactly how I like it. I'm in a pretty nice place right now. But when I moved from Bright, the shift to volume was of it to hit the sheer scale. I mean, you walk into from brewing on a 1,000 litre brew house, and then you walk past 20,000 litres, and it's just a sheer, completely different looking beast. But also the attention and focus on quality and consistency and process. Even though we were probably quite technical at Bright for a small brewery compared to some others, it was just another level up in terms of how closely things were tracked, and also how specified or specialist people's roles were. So you might move from sort of doing at Bright, I was doing everything from milling grain all the way through to washing kegs and packaging. At Little Creatures, a brewer will spend a year or two on just the brew house making wort, or just in packaging. And so people were fairly highly specialized, very, very highly trained. The standard was very high. And the standard of beer coming out was extremely high, and under sort of a meticulous microscope, both figuratively and literally, all of the time. So, that was a really, really great experience, and was able to spend time in White Rabbit with the barrel hall, in the Little Creatures side in microbiology, to sort of get a real sort of broad experience, I suppose, but in a lot of detail in each role as well.
Yeah, I'd imagine the culture shock from a business operational standpoint, let alone the art and science of brewing, just separately, the sheer size and scale of the operation with people in different roles and obviously different departments and all that type of thing. How did you deal with that kind of shift from a kind of more of we'll call it a family style operation, where small team, up to a heavily corporatized business, which no doubt by that stage Little Creatures was.
Yeah, absolutely. It was very much Lion by the time I got there, and the transition was probably daunting at the start, in the sense of, for the big one was the language used. So I remember going to the first sort of team meetings, I suppose, that they had on a daily basis, and I reckon 80% of the words used were an acronym that I had no idea what it meant. And so just getting used to that was a big thing, in terms of just the language, how people communicate, and also Lion being, I would consider, quite progressive in the way that they operate, from even the language used. So, not a single mention of human resources. It was always people and culture, and it was always about people, and changing, in a good way, it changed my perception on sort of how we can associate with people, and interact with people, and sort of how we treat employees rather than being a number. We really were individuals with individual strengths. So being in a much bigger team and seeing that was really, really good, and definitely shaped the way sort of I probably manage people now. At Creatures, I never clocked on. I was never, punching a number in the morning and having every minute of my day tracked. It was really good from that culture piece. And sort of what was expected of a brewer at Little Creatures was quite different in terms of responsibility. There was a fair bit on a brewer's shoulder at Creatures, and I think that was great for my development personally. So it was definitely a big culture change, not just because of the scale and the size, but also because of the way that the brewers were expected to operate.
Digging into the kind of roles and responsibilities a little bit more, I think that's pretty interesting. So the obviously a huge uplift in terms of your responsibility and no doubt the quality that would have been expected. No doubt Bright's quality is up here, but you go into a much more corporatized business, it just has to be further up. Can you give me a bit more detail about that, the kind of responsibilities that you would have to undertake that were different to a smaller brewer? I think the reason why I ask is the whole audience for this podcast is brewers and brewers at businesses of all different sizes. So just understanding that a bit deeper would be really valuable for the audience.
Yeah, for sure. So I think from a responsibility point of view, besides the fact that, let's use the packaging hall, for example, when, they're packaging, say, 500,000 litres a week, which is more than Bright did nearly in a year at that point. So there's obviously a lot of beer on the line, but in terms of the sort of expectation or the standard of brewer, besides sort of running, a machine and when it breaks, sort of stepping away and just waiting for someone to come fix it whilst we had trades and everything, there was a lot more problem solving. We were expected to do the problem solving, the root cause analysis. We were working on improvement projects, process improvement projects throughout our time there. So, you might be on the brew house brewing every day, but in the background, you've got an improvement project for how we can keep barrel stock separate from normal beer, or it might be a safety project, or it could be about, brew house efficiency or whatever it might be. Some of those more probably where you would, in a even bigger brewery, say like Tui's, might have a technical brewing team. A lot of the Little Creatures brewing team took on a lot of that project work, and that was really, really good. That gave us the ability to sort of focus on maybe something different to what we were doing on shift, but also gave us the skills to actually work through those processes. And how does a project go from start to finish? How do we solve these complex problems? And we were provided with a lot of tools from Lion to allow us to do that effectively and efficiently.
At the extra, so with the extra breadth of the role and the responsibilities, we look at the smaller breweries, and it's interesting. Your background's really interesting because two of the breweries that actually, I think it was our first two podcasts, both breweries, both founders of the breweries, and also brewers at one point came from a science background, and they both did science at university. So it's funny that you came from that background, but switching up the type of product that you're producing. Obviously, there's business as usual, and you produce your beer at scale and volume, be it the standard IPA or something like that. But then you need to go and switch up if you've got certain beers that are going to be on for a short period of time. Like I don't know, you probably at Bright you may have done a few more of those because you've got a little bit more flexibility. But did you do much of that type of stuff at Little Creatures, like certain brews for certain times of year and all that type of thing?
Yeah, quite a bit. And Creatures was probably different again from a production point of view compared to, let's say, Tui's again as examples. It was Lion's innovation brewery to a degree, and White Rabbit was a massive part of that as well, which is on the same site. But we would have easily worked through maybe 30 or 40 new products a year easily. And they might be one-off beers for different brands. Even the regular sort of SKU mix would have been up in the high teens, maybe the low 20s. And there would have been a new product coming through at least, once or twice a month, whether it was in White Rabbit or in Little Creatures. So there was still a lot of new product development. There was a lot of trialing and even working with other breweries such as Brooklyn. I was part of a project to get Brooklyn Bel Air Sour into White Rabbit, and that involved a lot of translating gallons and pounds of hops from the West. And doing emulations, making sure beers were tasting right before we signed contracts and got beer out the door under other brands. So there was also a lot of that as well. Yeah,
it's interesting. How would you how to be able to train your palate to be able to kind of match them up perfectly and be able to produce what they produce over there? I'd imagine that would have been quite a daunting task.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I think the biggest sort of thing we're able to do at a brewery that size is run pretty complete analysis from a numbers point of view on the beers, and we know our process and our brew houses enough that we know we can very confidently hit those numbers on the head with our process. And then, like you said, it's about going to sensory after that. And a lot of the time it was involving some of the team in the US or wherever the parent brewery was to sign off on it from a sensory point of view. But we were fairly confident in our process in the sense that we could analyze a beer they give us down to the nth degree and then translate that into a recipe that we can put through our system and be very, very confident that at least the numbers that come out the other end are going to be very, very close, and hopefully the beer is as well from a sensory point of view. So once again, understanding that process really, really well allows us to emulate 20 brands in a year with a pretty high degree of confidence. And
would you start with the exact same raw materials? So obviously the base level materials are pretty important to getting that finished product. Would you use the exact same materials, or would you use Aussie versions of their materials?
It would depend a little bit on the beer. A lot of the time, if there were special ingredients, let's say Canadian malted oats, we would go and grab exactly the same malted oats from exactly the same maltster and try to replicate it that way as best we could. Some of our base malt might remain the same if it was, let's say, a big double IPA where the base malt might sort of play a much more secondary role in the overall character of the beer. We could get away with it, but a lot of the time, if say Panhead from New Zealand wanted exactly this recipe and exactly this malt, we would go and get it. And once again, being in a company as big as Line, getting your hands on those raw materials is a fair bit easier at a lot of times than it is if you're smaller. You have that purchasing power and you have the ability to go and grab exactly what you need when you need it as well, which is super important. So a lot of the time it was, the easiest way to at least be close to emulating their product is to use the same raw materials, and we'd do that where we could.
And you've obviously got people that can source it for you, which is that's no doubt pretty time consuming if you don't have all of those existing contacts in place, which Line probably do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I saw in the second half of your journey at Little Creatures and Lion that you focus more on the kind of the microbiology side of things. Can you run me through exactly what microbiology is relating to beer production, and then kind of what really the detail of what you did in that particular role? Because I think that'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So the way I got into the micro role was Rhiannon, our microbiologist, was going away on leave, and so there was a secondment opportunity there. And obviously having a bit of biology experience from uni, it was something that appealed to me, and probably a little bit of focus on beer quality as well. So in a brewery, the microbiologist role really is about being the last sort of gate, I suppose, the beer has to make it through before it can go out to be sold. So what I was basically doing is grabbing beer samples or wort samples at literally every part of the process. So from the brew house, from fermenters, from bright tanks, from finished packaged product, plating them out or getting them genetically tested and making sure there were no spoilage organisms in the beer was the primary one. And that was mainly from a off flavor or true to type sort of perspective, rather than, there was obviously a bit of food safety in there as well. But beer being a little bit safer with ethanol and pH, we don't have to stress too much about that. But it was mainly about making sure we weren't sending out spoiled beer or beer that's going to pop a can or a bottle or taste gross in keg. And we were basically checking for microbes all the way through the process, which, tends to be reasonably time consuming. If you're, getting sort of 20 to 30 samples, a brew house that's doing 30, 35 brews a week and has 27 fermenters, there's a lot to test. So,
it's a lot.
Yeah. But basically I was that last gate before that beer was allowed to be released to the trade.
Yeah, cool.
Make sure nothing bad's growing in it.
Yeah, awesome. And that kind of brings me to the next point. What beer do you drink? Because obviously you're sitting there tasting and trying beer a fair bit. Is there a certain type of beer that you drink, both from a general standpoint as well as a brand, or?
A brand less so, but pretty much any dark beer, a porter or a stout, I absolutely love. Even when it's a little warmer, I'll have one pretty happily. The other would be a really, really well-made lager. They're really, really hard to make well, so I think I really, really appreciate a a really well-made lager. But yeah, they're probably the two that jump out at me. But in terms of any brand loyalty, I'm pretty happy to try anything from, the biggest brewery out there. I'll happily have a Carlsberg or, a nice little tidy craft lager out of the corner of somewhere.
Awesome. And you finish up at Lion and Little Creatures, and you go and take the job at Mismatch. Now, run me through the timing. Run me through the timing of. I know that Mismatch were part of an acquisition last year. Can you run me through the timing of how your role fitted into that process, or whether it was before or after, and what that process was like? I think it was pretty busy with acquisitions, say, over the last 12, 24 months, up until probably 6 or 7 months ago, and it's really quietened down in the space.
Yep.
So can you run me through if you were there, any culture shifts and all that type of thing?
Yeah, so I probably came in a fair bit after that acquisition. I can't quite remember off the top of my head when the Mighty Craft one was. I think it was a little bit after the middle of the year or around the financial year.
Yeah, I think it was about July, August. It was all settled, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was still at Creatures until January, so I didn't get to see much of that transition. I've heard a reasonable amount about it here, but I was at Lion when they purchased Stone and Wood, so I saw a little about. So like you said, there was a lot of noise and a lot of action around that time. Definitely in the last 6 months of last year. But I've pretty much walked into, in this role, a very, very familiar feeling situation to the one I walked out of, if that makes sense. So yeah. I think the 6 months leading up to when I started here probably provided a decent amount of time for people to adjust. And to be completely honest, from the sounds of things, there hasn't had to be a very large amount of adjustment from the production floor
awesome
perspective. It seems to have been quite seamless, and they've done a really good job of communicating any changes if there are pretty well, and everyone seems pretty happy. I don't get the sense that people are operating too differently to how they did from a brewery point of view.
Yeah, cool. And who are you working for at Mismatch, and kind of how did they get started?
So in terms of who I'd be working for, do you mean so like Ewan and the GM?
Yeah. So if you can give us a bit of a background on who founded the business, and then kind of where they came from and what their story. I know that it's not your story to tell, but I think that if you can give us a bit of an indication about the story in general, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, no worries. So Ewan and Mark are the two that sort of have been remaining here, but are basically a group of people who are around the food and beverage industry, in the hospitality industry, founded Mismatch in 2013. And that was, the brainchild of quite a few people, but Ewan was a big part of the brewing process, or he really wanted to get on the kit. So he was brewing, and it was pretty much working on the basis of contract brewing at Big Shed and a few other breweries. I think Hawkers and Brewpack got involved at some point to try and supply the volume. But so it started as really a brand that they wanted to push into hospitality venues. They didn't have their own home, if you like, or brewery that was their own. They were brewing out of Big Shed, mainly under contract. Ewan went and got a qualification overseas, came back and really started to push the beers a little bit further. I think Archie's Red IPA was one that sort of struck a chord with a lot of people and brought Mismatch to the forefront in their earlier years. And then in 2018, I'm pretty sure it was, Lot 100 opened. Champion Independent Beer at the Indies in Sydney, I believe it was the lager. So Mismatch probably started to get a little bit more of a reputation for making really, really consistently good beer. But it was only in 2018, so what's that, 5 years later, that it really got its own home up here in the hills with Lot 100 and actually having a dedicated brewery. It's not the easy way to do it either. Contracting and trying to push volume out when you don't own the kit is a big challenge. So Ewan and the guys sort of worked through that up until this point, and then obviously the Mighty Craft acquisition last year happened, and a few little structure changes. Ewan has probably transitioned out of a real production role, or being super, super, super hands-on. He's just wearing too many hats, or was, up over the new year. So that's kind of where I'd come in and tried to get as much of the production under my sort of umbrella, if you like, and allow him to do some of the more overarching big mighty craft stuff.
Yeah, awesome. And where do you see the, I guess, the production trends going in beer? Obviously, you've been in it long enough now. You've seen different beers and different levels of popularity throughout that process. Can you run me through what you've seen over the last kind of 24 months and any predictions that you've got?
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting. I think we're in an interesting place, definitely in the low non-alcohol category that keeps growing and sort of refuses to not make a fair bit of noise, if that makes any sense. I think it was something maybe people thought would be a little blip that, we'd see and then we see it fade away. But if anything, that's just getting louder and louder every year. I think a shift away from the big hoppy arms race that was probably happening just before or around when I started brewing, where IPAs were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and ABVs were going through the roof, bitterness was going through the roof. The guys like Pirate Life, they made their name on some really, really good hoppy pale ales. I think whilst people still appreciate them, I think there's now a little bit more of a focus on a little bit more balance maybe, and a little bit more or sort of less hop, less bitterness, and stuff like craft lagers are becoming very popular. And I think that's a little bit of maturity in the industry showing. It was funny to watch the trend maybe from a bigger brewery, because all the things that maybe 5-10 years ago that got knocked, being fairly light lager and easy drinking beers, even the guys that were drinking big crazy IPAs 5 years ago are now looking for something a little bit more easy to enjoy and a little bit more refreshing.
I think you always got to look at the commerciality of the situation. And if the big hoppy IPAs, they're not for everyone, obviously. And then, but lagers are probably a much more consumed beer, especially in Australia. So it's interesting that you've got your kind of craft beer set that obviously have grown up on those IPAs, but then you've got everyone else, and obviously you probably want to make there is an entry point that you have to find to everyone else at some point if you want to look at the commercials of actually becoming really profitable.
Absolutely, and I think the other difference is that there are so many more big small craft breweries, if you like, now, and once you get to a certain size, you need to start tapping into another part of the market. You cannot rely on the 6% or whatever it might be that are into all those crazy beers. You need to start appealing to a broader audience, or you literally just can't make enough liters in the year to make yourself viable. So I think that's another thing we've seen in the last, say, decade is, a craft brewery is no longer a tiny little 600 litre brew pub kit, that services 150 local patrons over the weekend. It has become a much bigger part of the sort of overall beer industry. And I think with that comes a need to appeal to a broader audience and to get more people drinking your beers. And really the only sensible way to do that is to present something that's a little bit more approachable. So I think some of the bigger craft breweries are sort of, the beer independents are realizing that. Even look at Stone and Wood, Pacific Ale, what they sort of did with what is really quite an approachable beer. People just couldn't get enough of it. If that was a big 7% hoppy IPA, you'd be doing 100th of the volume. So I think part of it is out of necessity to remain viable if you want to be big and independent and craft.
I think independents now especially have almost got a second lifeline as well. The most recent government legislation around the beer excise, I think for the kind of medium size, for those medium sized breweries that are starting to do really good volume, but the excise tax just takes a big chunk out of them. I think for those type of businesses, for the ones that are small and all the rest of it, sure, it's a little bit of extra cash flow, but it's nothing too much. I think for at volume, where you're that independent brewery that does volume, I think it's a really big help. And I think it's good. I think we're going to see some breweries that we're kind of thinking about, oh, is this a good long-term view? I think some of those guys have got another lifeline and are going to really excel and poke their head out over the next little bit.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that's the direction it takes. It's definitely a different beast when you're not relying on a tap room and making big margins on kegs, over your own taps. You're playing with the big guys, and every little cent counts when you're competing with Lion and CUB, because they can afford to do things on a cents per litre basis much, much more cheaply. And probably the thing that I think people are starting to realize as well is the quality does not have to suffer with those volumes. Little creatures can make 26 million litres of beer a year that is of exceptional quality. Just because they're making a lot of it doesn't mean that corners have been cut. So ultimately for the smaller independents, they need to compete both at a price point, but also with the knowledge that their beer might not necessarily be technically better. That's a real challenge.
Yeah, and the infrastructure that that other big guys can put into pubs and that type of thing is just far exceeds anything you can do as a small or medium sized brewer. So you
Absolutely.
really do have to win on the quality, don't you? I mean, price. You're probably never going to be able to truly compete with the bigger guys. I wouldn't have thought, but so quality has to be exceptional, and you obviously have to be really competitive on price. So it's a hard gig, but there's obviously some people doing it really well.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Mate, last thing, for yourself, you've obviously had a really good start to your career. How old are you?
29.
29. You've obviously, I mean, it's an exceptional 20s, which is awesome. Obviously you want to stick it at Mismatch for a while now. Where do you see yourself going, career wise in beer? Would you ever want to travel with it or anything like that? Or do you love the Australian brewing industry?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot. I thought about whether travel would ever sneak into my career, whether it was short-term or long-term. I think when I was with someone like Lion, where you did have breweries, whether it was brew pubs in Singapore or now New Belgium in the US, that seemed to me like it would be on the cards if I had stuck around there for a little while. Where I am now, I'm obviously only 3-4 months in and really, really happy here. I can see myself sticking around and I would like this role to probably be my career defining role, if for lack of a better term. I'd like this to be the one that I look back on spending, a really good amount of time here, defining myself as a brewer, as a head brewer, and also helping sort of shape the industry here. I think realistically for me, the industry in Australia has so much potential and there's so much growth still here that I think it's a really exciting time to be a brewer in Australia. And I have full intentions of being a part of that for the foreseeable future, for sure, for a long time, I hope. So, a little bit of travel here and there would be lovely, but I don't think I'd really be eyeing off too much of a long-term thing anymore. I think Australia is a pretty good place to be. And in this role especially, I feel like I've got the resources and the people around me to be able to really achieve a lot of things here. That's really an exciting sort of, it's almost nice to have this last 5 years done all of that growing and probably jumping around more than I thought I would. But it feels nice to be in a place now where I am, where I'm at a brewery that makes technically great beer with really, really good people around me and a really good support network in the form of both you and Mighty Craft as a general. That network is really, really good and something I'm used to coming from Lion. Awesome. So to be able to tap into that and really push Mismatch as far as we can push it in the next 5-10 years, that's something I'm pretty excited to do.
Yeah, awesome. The limitations I think are only there as far as industry size is concerned. I think that the fact that craft accounts for probably 8 or 9% of beer in Australia just shows if we can increase that by 2% or 3%. There's your growth, and everyone joins in on that growth. So I think really the whole industry should be pushing towards getting the education up and around about independent beer and about that kind of story about about getting back to, where it came from, who the people behind the beer are, and all that type of thing. I think all of that's got a lot of value. And I think that a lot of breweries tell that story really well, but I think they can do it so much better. Some of them can do it so much better. And I think that's where that 2 or 3, 4% comes from. I think it's from people feeling connected to their local brewery, or people feeling connected to that story. I think it's really important.
Yeah, definitely. I think that story, and it's something some craft brewers are so good at. And when we were talking about sort of price point and quality, that's probably the biggest differentiator, is that story, having a connection to that story. Instead of just being another brand, what do you represent for your local community? And that can be, that can even be your regional community. I think Mismatch has done a good job of championing SA in general, rather than necessarily being a hyper local thing. And I think that's, like you said, where the next 2 to 4% can come from, is really connecting with people through your story, through your brand, and what you're sort of standing for. And I think it's important to probably stand for something, and at least want to share your story and have some sort of personality, rather than just trying to put forward a brand to people. I think there's a lot of headroom here in terms of growth.
Mate, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Tom Wood from Mismatch Brewing, guys. Thanks.